publishers to really think in a different way than they're used to, which isn't easy.
What are the things, Jeff, might publishers have to think differently about when it comes to doing this?
Well, I think it was really interesting to hear the numbers on the Kindle. I think Jeff Bezos talked about it when you launched the last one, but I think there's two things that struck me about what was said by Amazon. And one is that this is happening very rapidly, and there's not as much time as we'd like to think. In the world, technology is being adopted at so much faster rate than it was 5 or 10 years ago even, that you really have to be on board of these things pretty quickly to take advantage. They're coming very quickly. I think I've also said there's really two areas that both ends of the publishing world can be changed by technology. One, and we're talking about Rochester, how you actually create work, how you think about interacting with the various parties involved in the creation of content, the update of content, where that comes from, how we create it, how we store it, so that when the next thing like the Kindle comes out or the ebook reader on the iPhone comes out, or you want to publish a piece of that content to the web or an enhanced version of that on the web, you can do that in a way that makes sense, that content is manageable for you to interrelate the pieces to. I think that's critical from a creation standpoint. Then there's a consumption standpoint. And I think that's what you're seeing in the Kindle, is that people want to consume these in totally different places. And the concept of a platform, in my mind, is something that is easy to consume wherever the consumer wants to take it. If I want to read my book on a computer, great. If I want to read my book on my iPhone, great. If I want to read it on a small Kindle or a big Kindle, great. The more of those you make possible, and the more you make the technology you are using to create and manage that content possible to easily publish to different modes, the more easily you'll be able to keep up with where users want to grab and interact with that content. And that's going to be, I think, I couldn't have imagined this before it came out, and it's, 3 years old? I had no idea the Kindle was coming, and I've now bought 2 different ones in the span of a year and a half. I think that pace is going to continue, and the real imperative is to make sure you're putting yourself in a position that doesn't bet on the current technology, but that bets that technology is going to change, and I want to be able to take advantage of it wherever it goes.
Michael, you work a lot with traditional publishers, print houses and such. What advice would you give for how people have to think about creating content, and more importantly, I think, or just as importantly, about all this existing content that's sitting there locked up in InDesign files and lead type?
Sure. The latter half of that I'm going to address separate, because that's the ugly one. But in terms of, I'll give the example based on a lesson plan I'm doing with my freshmen. So they come in fall. There's a course called Digital Foundations. They're 18-ish. They're arriving, and within the first 3 weeks or so, we do a basic page layout lesson, and we go through tools, acquired InDesign. I'm an equal opportunity person, but the projects are very simple. They go to Project Gutenberg. They pull down text content. We bring down in plain text as well as HTML, because it's available for most of us there. And I make them go through each to understand the limitations. And then they very simply do a page layout. The first one is for a large text edition. I joke about my father, whose site is going on a little bit. So my father needs a bigger type here. So they set up style sheets, or in this case usually InDesign, and they flow the text in and they apply their styles to all the types of content, because the content in the HTML version is tagged. And they get through that and they grumble, because it's a fair amount of work the very first time. And then the lesson changes immediately, and they go to two more books, they only have 10 minutes. And the next 2 books, one's a pocket guide, and then one is their choice. They don't really care within some parameters at all. They can print off the digital press. And they look at me, they're reading 3 books inside this like 3-hour lab sessions. Again, 3 books, 3 hours. And with 1 or 2 that struggle with the first, because the first one it's a headset change. And depending on the text, the exact text they pull down, they bring down the red and black. It's the big bomb. But by and large, they go through it, and then we talk about after. What's the power of that? Well, I separated really the content from the styling, and that allowed me to transform it very quickly. And with literally just a few quick changes, change your master pages, go there, it's done. And that's the power of that. In our building, we have about 800 to 1,000 design students who are just getting introduced to that content. So that wave is still coming. So let's talk about how much work is going to be. The youngest entrants in this are just getting exposed to this concept. Now the web knows this well, so Web 1.0, if you will, and certainly Web 2.0, they live and die by this kind of stuff. But in the publishing world, when we think about print-based publishing historically, this is the paradigm shift. So that's kind of, I guess, my academic end to do that. That's what it takes. It takes looking at what do I have as an asset, how do I want to format that for its final destination, and make sure that it's tagged or formatted in a way that is very easy to transform. I often joke about, we create content, we edit it, and we transform it to wherever. Those are the 3 stages of publishing, as we kind of walk through them. On the transforming existing content, that's a nightmare, depending on how it's derived. So, for instance, I came through when I work, because I'm an but I started with Quark 331. It came on about 6 floppy disks. And with that, you learn, you put typesetting in Quark. You do everything in Quark. It was amazing.
Wait a second, can you define floppy disk for our audience?
Sure. It's very old technology. It's a great coaster. It's funny I use it in Quark now. I actually use it for coasters in the house just because I can. Photoshop 1, 2 floppy disks in case you care. Anyways, so you take that content is completely locked. So the only way that you can transform it is to go and you select all the text and you manually start to reformat it, and that's a very painful process. And so for publishers with a deep library, say, we're going to count on PDF. Look at how you made the PDF. You might be in big trouble. You might be fine. But as you're starting now, 2009, they haven't done it yet. Take a hard look at how you're creating the content and pull back and go, how would I do it if I was doing it on the web? And that will start to give you some of the inklings into how fast can I transform it down into things. Because again, it's a simple separation. This is the content, this is the styling. An easy analogy for that, back to the newspaper example, writers don't usually format their own content, right? So your journals, they submit the content and then the designers apply the style. It's exactly the same thing, but now they're separate technical things. This is now the text content, image content, so on.
How many of you think you're fine with your content? Raise your hands.
Oh, no.
Okay, everybody's in trouble. Good. No. We've talked about a few different potential learning platforms here that from the folks who are up here. Google Apps, various blogs, movies turning print, Ma and Pa Kindle, as I think of them now. I will not say which is which. What I'm curious about, though, what other learning platforms should we be considering? Should we be considering, iPhones obviously, but other types of mobile devices, other things that we're just not thinking about? And will there be a hierarchy or sharing of information across devices?